But then they ended the primaries. They would not let me run against them. They literally canceled the primaries. Oh, they felt that they had to destroy democracy in order to save it from Donald Trump.
Hello and welcome to the Weekend Spectator. My name is Grace Reilly, and I'm here with Paul Kengor, your favorite co-host. Paul, we had a great week this past week. We were at the American Spectator Gala where you got to sit down with a very special guest and interview him, a nice fireside chat, and we also had Rand Paul. But first, let's jump into that guest that you had a more personal conversation with.
Yeah, so it was Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and it was really neat to meet him and spend some time with him. So I've emailed with him, I've texted with him, and by the way, he's very personable, very approachable. And so I had already I had interviewed him probably 3 or 4 times, going back to probably about mid 2023 when he first declared his candidacy for the president.
And we talked about him on last week's episode, so if you haven't seen that,
right,
check it out.
Yeah, in fact, I strongly encourage, if you haven't seen that, watch the previous episode, because we talked about the security threats that he faced and how his own family accused him of being a betrayer because he won't support the Democratic Party, that, as he put it, quoting Ronald Reagan, right, borrowing from Ronald Reagan, he didn't leave the Democratic Party left him.
Yeah, and another highlight too, just on unity, and how it was so great to see him be willing to talk to the other side and be willing and humble enough to really do what he thought would be best to save the future of America, even if that meant backing out of the race. And we talked about the speech that he gave when he left the race and endorsed Trump. Specifically, I quote to highlight on that unity point is when he said that we have to, on both sides, love our children enough to put some of the stuff aside and try to do what's best together and to cooperate. So that was a great speech he had given, and it was really cool to see him speak with you.
Well, one of his examples of unity was Donald Trump reaching out to him and then RFK Jr. reciprocating. And here again, for liberals and Democrats, and we could play a clip on this. One of the things that he said during the interview, I asked him flat out, I said, did Kamala Harris, right, reach out to you?
About unity, did Kamala Harris reach out to you?
No, but after President Trump reached out to me, and I began these series of discussions with him, these extraordinary discussions, really, because he was a completely different person than the person that he's been portrayed. And I've known Donald Trump
Bob Carroll always says, yeah.
And, I've been subjected to the same defamations and perjuries, et cetera. So I also understand that in person, you could be a completely different person than you're portrayed.
Right.
But there's no questioning that's part of this gullibility among Democrats. Now they believe whatever CNN tells them.
Yeah.
But I had these really revelatory, and I've known Donald Trump for probably 35 years. I've sued him twice and won both lawsuits. And I actually, during one of the times, I was suing him against a stop a golf course that he was putting up in the New York City reservoir system, and we didn't want the golf course putting pesticides into the reservoir, and I was suing him, and my wife wanted to go to Florida for the weekend with her kids, and to visit my mother over Easter, and I said, well, I don't want to pay for tickets, and she said, what if I can get a free ride? I said, okay, if you can do that. She called me a couple days later and said, I got a ride, and I said, from who? And she said, from Donald Trump. And I said, I'm suing him. And she said, he knows, but he doesn't care. And so I did get that side of his personality, that he was, he could fight you, but still kind of enjoy you.
Right, yeah, and be friends.
But I had these discussions with him for a while, and, it began to see that on the issues that he was very enthusiastic about including the issues. He had two issues, really, the economy and the border. And I brought him these other issues, which was ending the war in Ukraine immediately, ending the censorship, surveillance, and then the making America healthy again.
So not MAGA, but MAHA, right? Yeah, making America
and on all of those, he was, number one, conversant and agreeing with me, but also very enthusiastic about, let's make that part of the campaign, and we'll have a unity party, we'll join up, and we'll make those sort of a joint platform of both your party and my party. So I was talking to him about that, but I said I should call Harris and see if she, is interested. So I still have friends in the Democratic Party. And,
maybe.
Yeah. And I called a number of them and said, can you see if she'll take a meeting with me? And they talked to her directly, and she said, no way.
Wow. So, wow. That's very revealing.
Yeah. So Kamala Harris wasn't exactly
that made the
reaching
audience
out to
laugh
RFK
too.
Jr. What's that?
That was one of the audience laugh moments throughout the night when he said, "Oh no, she has not reached out."
Yeah, and I mean, once again, so the Democrats claim that they want unity. The other thing that he talked about, we talked about the whole democracy thing, right? These are the champions of democracy, and they didn't have a very democratic, small d, democratic convention in the summertime, right? So we talked about how. We talked about this, you and I, on the podcast last week or previous podcast, and I brought it up with him. He was accused of being a betrayer of his family, and yet I noted that his brother, or his father, RFK Sr., his uncle John F. Kennedy, his grandfather Joseph P. Kennedy, the patriarch of the family, they all crossed party lines in previous decades when they felt that their party was not being something that you should support. They didn't have this idea like apparently the Kennedys, a lot of the Kennedys do today, that, oh, D next to your name, rubber stamp, okay, I'm going to support you. But I pointed out that Bobby Kennedy Jr., his father, Bobby Kennedy Sr., worked for Joe McCarthy. He supported Eisenhower against Adlai Stevenson. He voted all three of them, the brother, the senior Robert Kennedy, JFK, and the father, Joe Kennedy, supported Richard Nixon in his Senate bid, Republican, against Helen Gahagan Douglas. And this was really cool. I didn't know this, Grace. And I've since talked to Bob Tyrell after the talk. Jeff Lord talked to me about this. Dan Flynn talked about this. John Gizzi, some of the kind of politicos who were there at the talk and who know their history really well. I didn't know about this. So RFK Jr. said that at the 1940 Democratic Convention, the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., so this would have been kind of the original Kennedy brother of the group, who tragically died in World War II. A lot of people thought that this was like the best of the Kennedy boys. It's really, the Kennedy family is so tragic. Everybody remembers JFK got shot and killed. RFK Sr. got shot and killed. Ted Kennedy, drove his vehicle, missed a bridge into Chappaquiddick, killed Mary Jo Kopechne. Most people don't know about Joe Kennedy Jr., the original one who got killed in World War II. He was going to be sort of the anointed one to run for president, even before John F. Kennedy. But RFK Jr. said that at the 1940 Democratic Convention for Jim Farley, I believe that it was, that Joe Kennedy supported Farley against FDR. And one of the reasons was they thought this is pretty undemocratic of this Democratic Party to run FDR for president again, right? You're supposed to have 2 terms. Now, the Constitution wasn't in yet with 2-term limits, but there is an understanding among American presidents that you serve 2 terms like George Washington did, and you step down. So the Kennedys supported the opposition guy against FDR at the 1940 Democratic Convention. So the point is, they have this long history of independence in the Kennedy family, and RFK Jr. is much like his dad, his uncle, his other uncle, his grandfather, in supporting Donald Trump and not supporting Joe Biden and not supporting Kamala Harris, especially when they wouldn't even provide him with security protection.
And another thing that I thought was really cool about your interview in this chat was when you brought up his father and you read out of Bob Tyrell's book directly about his story with his father before he got assassinated. Now, that it would be really cool if you'd share a bit about that. We'll put a little clip here. But I thought that that was so interesting to tie the American Spectator and Bob Tyrell all the way just through the family to RFK Jr. sitting down at the American Spectator Gala now.
I thought that's how we had to start it, right? So I sat down and I said, it's fantastic that we got you here. And you might not know this, but this is a reunion of sorts between Bobby Kennedy and the American Spectator. And I pulled out Bob Tyrrell's book, which I happen to have right here because I just took it out of my suitcase. But yeah,
Yep. How do we get out
yeah,
of here?
how do we get out of here?
Who's that
And I
line
said,
from? Who said
yeah,
that?
I said, Bobby, your dad, those are your dad's words right there. And the whole audience is like, wow, right?
From earlier. His memoir, How Do We Get Out of Here? These are actually the words of your dad. And I've got to read a little bit from this. I think you'll be really touched by this. This is page 1 of his memoir.
So I read from page 1, and Bob Tyrrell is in an auditorium. He's a student at Indiana University of Bloomington. He had already started the American Spectator, which was founded in 1967. At that point, it's called The Alternative. And Bobby Kennedy is speaking on stage. And this is typical of Bob Tyrrell, right? Tyrrell ends up the only guy behind the curtain at the auditorium. It was like behind Robert F. Kennedy Sr. And Robert F. Kennedy Sr. is speaking. And I describe he's wearing like sounds like the same kind of blue suit that his son was wearing when I was talking to him. And, just lit the place up, electric, and, kind of standing ovation at the end of the speech. And then he walks behind the curtain, and there's Bob Tyrrell, our Emmett Tyrell Jr., who would have been, they got to do the math, 24 years old at the time. And so Bobby Kennedy Sr. looks at Bob Tyrrell and says, how do we get out of here, kid? Right? And he says, follow me, sir. So they go this way, that way. And Tyrrell's like, where do I go? Right? Right, left. And suddenly he just like sees a sign for an exit. They walk outside, open the door, and there's his car waiting, amazingly. By the way, no security protection here, right? It's one of the things that really doomed him in Los Angeles when he was assassinated just 6 weeks later. But he sits down in the car and he puts his hand out to shake young Bob Tyrrell to say, thanks, kid. And Tyrrell reaches out, pulls a Reagan for president button out and sets it in his hand. And Bobby Kennedy cracked up. And
Sure.
Bobby Kennedy had debated Ronald Reagan the year before, May 1967, in a nationally televised debate. Everybody agrees that Reagan beat Kennedy, including Kennedy. In fact, Kennedy's words were, who's the SOB that got me on stage with Reagan, right? I didn't read this on Tuesday night at the gala because it would have been too heartbreaking. But the next line in Bob Tyrrell's memoirs, he says, the next time I saw Bobby Kennedy's face and blue eyes, he was laying there on the floor on a camera, right, on television at the Los Angeles hotel because he had been shot in the head by Sirhan and was bleeding to death. So I obviously didn't mention that. But that's how we started it. And I also talked about how, the rule that provides people for protection today when they're running for president. So, Bobby, that was because of the assassination of your dad. And the one guy not to get it as a campaign candidate was Robert F. Kennedy Jr., because the Biden administration refused to provide him with Secret Service protection. He goes through just how serious the threats were to him while he wasn't getting that Secret Service protection.
Change the rule to make it so that if you met certain metrics, you could get it. Well, I met those metrics.
Totally.
And I was the first candidate in history that requested Secret Service protection and didn't get it. And I was getting, very, very serious threats. I had a guy show up at a rally that I did in Los Angeles, and he identified himself as a U.S. Marshal. He had a U.S. Marshal badge. He had federal ID on his belt, and
weapons.
What?
And weapons.
Well, we later found out my security team looked at his badge, and this is Gavin DeBecker's, private security team, which I think is the best in the world, and they saw that his badge was a little bit shiny, and they thought something's wrong. So they detained him. They found 2 shoulder holsters fully loaded with magazines. They took his backpack, which had knives, a number of other guns, including a laser-guided pistol, and a lot of spare magazines. And otherwise, if they hadn't noticed that, he would have been escorted to the green room where I was at that time. So, and then that guy, before he left home, he recorded his first Instagram posting, and it was a posting that said, "I'm on a mission, I may not come back alive, and if I don't come back, everybody report to your commander-in-chief." So it was not, and I had 4 break-ins at my house. One of them got to the 2nd floor with my family home. So, we had 68 pages that we provided the Secret Service of threats and attacks against me, and we made 6 separate requests, and each time they refused. And they clearly were doing it because the agency was politicized, and they were they knew that I was spending a lot of money. We were spending $1 million a month on security, and they knew that this was a way to bleed me dry.
On top of that, I think it's relevant to bring up. I mean, this is a topic that's really been circulating recently, this idea of Secret Service for these candidates. And even just this past week, President Trump put out a statement about more attempts on his life and more threats to his life from Iran, and how important the security is and how there should be more security, quite frankly, especially with that regime out to get him. So this is something that keeps developing. We've talked about this topic on our show more than we wish that we would have to, right?
Right.
I mean,
Right.
but it's
Well, and Bobby Kennedy. So I read a quote that he had given me last October, 2023, when he was being denied Secret Service protection, and I said, "Here's what you told me," right? And he told me, he said, "I'm not so much worried about myself, but I'm worried about my family, people around me at a rally or an event, an innocent bystander being shot." And I said, Bobby, that's exactly what happened at the Trump rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, where other people got hit, including this poor soul, Corey Comparatori, who lost his life over that. And then I asked him, I said, "I've heard it's true that only after Trump was shot at the Butler rally did the Biden administration finally give you that Secret Service protection." He said, "Yes, they did, but only for about a month. And then it stopped again."
Yeah, which is just absolutely insane. And another thing that you guys didn't quite get to, so the talk was long but really good. You didn't quite get to the health conversation, which is something that obviously is a pillar of what that he's doing now in his campaigning alongside President Trump, but also just in what his mission has been this entire time, running for president at all. And it's something that's really interesting, and I'm especially appreciative that we have someone standing up and trying to make it a focal point in our country that we have such serious problems and corruptions in the food industry and the health industry. And he's done an excellent job pointing that out. And we'll talk about Rand Paul in a minute too, who also did such work. He's one of the top conservative fighters that we have in Congress, and he always has been. So, and his speech was excellent also, and he touched on COVID a bit too, and just government corruption.
Yeah, he's a doctor, right? And he wrote the book on, well, really kind of, and by the way, this was a coincidence that it turned out this way. But we had probably the 2 most prominent Fauci critics, Rand Paul.
Exactly. And
Yeah,
that's what I think is so interesting. So Rand Paul delivers a speech, and I think right now, because RFK is obviously big in the Make Health Great Again, but we can't forget Rand Paul's been fighting this fight. I mean, he's been in Congress behind the scenes, and he's been a steadfast conservative fighter all this time. So he's many people's heroes. I thought it was nice. RFK Jr. called Rand Paul a hero of his too, actually, which was cool on stage.
He wanted to project economic power abroad, like Rand Paul just said, who's one of my heroes, by the way. Instead of...
He also delivered a great speech, and I had the pleasure of meeting both of them quickly, which was really great, and a great opportunity that the gala provided. So that was cool.
Well, and they had, so when I was talking to Bobby's advance person, probably about an hour before the event, maybe an hour and a half, and we had to have a lot of security, right? We it was at the National Press Club. We had a lot of security, most security we've ever had at a
Well, we
spectator
endorse that,
gala.
obviously.
Yeah, yeah. And so I was talking to his advance person, Stephanie, and I said, what time do you think you'll arrive at the event? And she said, well, we want to get there early enough because Bobby wants to hear Rand Paul, wants to hear him speak. So that was telling right there. And then when Bobby and I talked, several times we actually made reference to Rand Paul. By the way, talking to Rand Paul prior to that, who's a doctor, an MD. His father, Ron Paul, is a doctor. And we talked a lot about Grove City College, where I teach, and you're an alum of May 2024. And Rand said, he said, I was born in Pittsburgh like you. So we were both born in Pittsburgh. And I said, let me guess, McGee Women's Hospital? And he said, yeah. And I said, I was too. And then he was telling me that his dad was a resident there at McGee Women's Hospital. And we started trying to figure out if maybe his dad might have been on the team that gave birth to me in December 1966. And he said, when were you born? And I gave him, he said, huh, that's quite possible. That's possible.
My conversation with him wasn't that cool, but that's funny. That's such a funny coincidence.
Right.
Well,
so it was, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so Rand Paul was great, and he talked about Fauci and COVID and the vaccines, being called an anti-vaccine and an anti-vax conspiracy theorist. So we had scheduled Rand like a year ago. I mean, we had Bob Luddy, who had been our chairman of the board at the American Spectator, made that happen. And Bob said, I think we could get Rand. Would you like us to? I'm like, yeah, go for it. It'd be great. I love Rand Paul. So we already had him scheduled. And then Bobby Kennedy really started emerging, right, over the last 6-7 months with all the different things that were happening to him. And I started to get to know him through never meeting him in person, but through text messaging and emails, one-on-one. And I said, we'd love to get you to this event. So we got him. It was a complete coincidence that we happened to get Bobby Kennedy and Rand Paul, two COVID.
And such a cool connection. I think it's a really important conversation to still have because it highlights a lot of the corruption that exists in our government. And especially with this election, one of the things that I think is crazy. So the left, Kamala Harris, has made it a point quite a few times to blame President Trump for the COVID economy and whatever they inherited and blah, blah, blah. Well, if everyone remembers, it was the Democrats who shut down the entire country during COVID.
Right.
And
Those
who were
talked a lot
mandating
about
vaccines, who shut down the economy, said that in order to go to certain restaurants, businesses, you had to have a vaccine card. They were the ones who completely overstepped in that way. Nancy Pelosi's the one who shut down California and, the country in Congress, and then was sitting in a hair salon during COVID while she said other people couldn't go to hair salons. We all remember the churches shutting down while the liquor stores stayed open. So Rand Paul was on the good side of that, and RFK has been questioning the vaccines too. So they're both really important fighters to have. And we didn't talk about COVID too much at the event, but I want to play a clip also that you shared with me earlier today, and we spoke a bit about RFK Jr. and his book and calling out Fauci.
I'll tell you something interesting that happened today, and I actually was going to mention this to Rand, because it was an extraordinary event to me. But Robert Redfield, who I really go after in my Fauci book, kind of a hammer and tongs, wrote an editorial in Newsweek magazine today saying that he was endorsing President Trump because President Trump was going to restore American health, and that President Trump, he said, a lot of people might surprise me to see this, but hear me say this, but he has chosen exactly the only person who can do this, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. This was breathtaking to me because this is the guy who's the head of the CDC that I've been criticizing for years. And then this afternoon he came over and had lunch with me. It's the first time I've ever met him. And the first thing he said to me is, you got everything right.
Wow.
Wow.
Right. So now you have someone who's the head of the CDC saying that all of RFK's criticisms of him, the CDC, Fauci, about questioning the way that the government handled this was right. I mean, how crazy is that?
Yeah, yeah. In fact, that little clip right there, about a minute long. So that night after the interview ended, Kennedy's team already had the full interview up on X. But that's about a minute, I think, and they took that and they cut that out and they sent that out as well. A bunch of different publications picked it up. I saw that Epic Times picked it up. I think that clip had over 600,000 views when
Oh,
when
yeah,
I
it's
saw
been
it on like
completely
Thursday
picked up
morning.
since the interview. And just to note for you all, in the American Spectator article associated with this video, so wherever you're watching these, whether it be on X, YouTube, Rumble, wherever, we always publish it on the website first. And in that, we'll embed a link to the full interview that RFK Jr. shared and also to this clip that we're referring to from it.
Another really interesting thing that Bobby Kennedy said that relates to all of this was, I said, he talked about big pharma, big government corruption, Democratic Party corruption, uh, but not just public sector, but private sector, and I brought up the issue of big tech and Wikipedia and some of these search engines. So if you type in your name on Wikipedia, this description comes up in the first paragraph, calling you this anti-vaccine conspiracy theorist. You're portrayed as like a crackpot, anti-science, this conspiracy monger, and you're accused of misinformation, right? He's accused of misinformation, disinformation. He talked about what they call malinformation. And I said, the thing that's so troubling about this, they did it to you, Bobby. They did it to doctors like Peter McCullough. They did it to the doctor who founded the messenger RNA method of creating a new vaccine. You'll get accused of misinformation, and you don't even know what it is that you've done wrong. And he said, well, it's worse than that. Then I go and I try to give them my citations of my sources for my material, and they won't even take it. And then if you try to go and edit his Wikipedia page, he's been blocked out. It's frozen. So you can't even change it. So anybody that right now wants to type him up, well, I see Paul and Grace talking about this, and they're playing these interesting clips. Let me see. If I look up Robert F. Kennedy Jr., what does it actually say, right? Wikipedia pops up, and wow, why didn't they tell me he's spreading misinformation, right? We don't even know what misinformation is. He doesn't know what it is. And the page is frozen. You can't even fix it. So this is part of the big tech smear, big pharma smear,
Oh, for sure.
everything. The corruption is so widespread. I think one of the reasons he's supporting Donald Trump is not just because of what the Democratic Party did to him, but he feels like he kind of needs somebody who can, shake up the system, I guess, right? Because everything has just become so rotten.
Yeah, well, and he said that that was his way in. So this is what he said to all of his supporters when he asked them to vote for Donald Trump, especially in swing states. He said that this is his way into the White House. This is his way into making a difference on that level. Voting for Trump because Trump has decided to team up with him and work with him. And he shared a bit about that in the speech as well, just how great Trump was in completely welcoming RFK Jr. into his
Right.
team and taking the mission on and going full speed ahead with it in his own campaigning, and how he's fulfilled every single promise that he's made to RFK Jr. about all of the health points and everything else. So how he's just been such a great man in the process of them working together. And that full statement's a bit too long to include here, but that's why we encourage you to watch the full clip. And on the misinformation point too, I mean, the way that big tech and the left has took on the term misinformation to just smear the other side and fact check the other side when it's information that isn't convenient for them is crazy. And the company I work at, Restoration of America, in their Language Watch series, which we've talked a bit about on the show before, they made a video about the term misinformation, identifying that the left and reporters and big tech, whoever it may be, will self-appoint themselves as fact checkers and
Right.
call things misinformation that aren't convenient to them. And that's so important to identify as conservatives so that we don't get stuck in this trap, and in this cycle that the left constantly uses. I mean, I've been labeled misinformation before, saying that were true, and COVID was the perfect example of that. I mean, if we say the word COVID on a Meta platform, for example, we don't post this on Meta platforms, but if we did, we'd have a flag on it. We'd have a label on it saying, read more, fact checkers, whatever, misinformation. RFK smeared for the vaccine. Trump's, they call I mean, the debate was a good example of this too, right? When they were fact-checking Trump, not fact-checking Kamala. It was a great example of the left trying to scream misinformation at anything that they didn't like.
Yeah, in fact, they could very well do it to us right now for this discussion we're having here. And we're not really even going into messenger RNA, virology, immunology. We're not even, by the way, stuff that I have a background in. So I was in organ transplantation from 1987 to 1991 before I changed careers. That's a whole long story. But yeah, and so they accuse you of that. You can't challenge it. And what's worse, and I said this to Kennedy, you don't even know who's accusing you of it. This could be some 21-year-old twitch, right out of college, who's working for Wikipedia or Google or whoever. It's a faceless person. So if you don't even know who to contact to go to with your grievance, to say, well, hold on a second here. You want dialogue? I'll dialogue. We can talk about this. What are you accusing me of? What am I misinforming here so I can try to, fix it? What is it, right? And Kennedy said, if I'm wrong, let me know where I'm wrong.
The idea that the First Amendment, this is what Democrats actually believe today, that the First Amendment does not protect misinformation and disinformation. The First Amendment protects all speech. It never makes a determination about whether something is a lie or the truth. It protects lies. It was written not to protect the speech that we consider convenient and we agree with, that is friendly to all of our attitudes. It was written specifically to protect the speech that nobody wants to hear.
So it's really, it's a form of censorship. He's complained about that. And also, too, when he said that he met Trump, and you'd mentioned this a couple minutes ago, he ended up liking Trump. He said he was surprised by that. But on the other hand, when he sees how much he's been smeared on a personal basis, he shouldn't have been surprised to find out that Donald Trump, when he met him, was a lot more likable than he had been portrayed. He'd been portrayed as a fascist and Hitler and everything else. He said he shouldn't have been surprised because of how nice Trump was to, I think, his mother at one point. And even when Bobby said he was suing Trump about
that was a
something.
funny moment of the night. Yeah, he explained a story about how when he was suing Trump, Trump was still joking with him and welcoming to him.
And that is that's the personal situation that that Bob Terrell had with him, that Beth Ailes, one of our board members, that she had with Trump, that Jeff Lord had with Trump. I've never personally met Trump, but they ended up really liking him. And to be fair, some people that work for him don't like him and hate his guts, right? Mm-hmm. But they all had positive experiences with him, and so did RFK Jr. So now they're working together, and the Democrats should not be angry at RFK Jr. over this, because, as I said in the articles that I did in him and everything else, sued him to keep him off the ballot in every single state. And now that he's endorsed Trump and he's asked to remove his name from ballots in different states, they're now suing to keep his name on the ballot in states where they believe that having his name on the ballot would help Kamala. So all this democracy, we're saving democracy, right? They sue to keep you off the ballot. And then when you want your name off the ballot, they sue to put you back on. It's total manipulation. It's complete fraud. And there's no greater hypocrites in cries for democracy than these liberals in the Democratic Party today.
Yeah, and that was one of the profound points of the night too, how not only with the First Amendment and the Harris Waltz attack on the First Amendment and wanting to censor speech, but all these calls for democracy, all of the actions that they've been taking show that they don't trust the American public, and they don't want to. They don't want people to have all the information, because the First Amendment doesn't just protect what they deem good speech. it protects misinformation too. It protects everything. And
Yeah, they want to control the information, and the information that they don't like, they'll either censor or they'll label it misinformation, or as he put it, as Bobby Kennedy put it, malinformation. And if that's the case, then that needs to be stopped.
yeah, and
Then you're not allowed to see it.
that's called communism.
Yeah, and they claim to be liberals, right? Yeah, and they call their opponents fascists, right? But that is a censoring and controlling of information. And Bobby Kennedy comes from a life and a family that was all about the open debate and dialogue of ideas, right? Including on issues like public health. But as he's learned, that's not what the modern party has been doing, especially since COVID, and it's pushed him out of the party.
It really is crazy. Well, it was so great, and that we got to see each other at this event for the first time in a while, and we got to spend some time with Rand Paul, with RFK Jr., with all of our friends at the American Spectator. Since you don't work at the office either, you're remote with Grove City College.
You got to meet my wife, which was great.
I did, yep. I got to meet your wife for the first time after years, I guess. So that was wonderful.
Right.
Your daughter and her fiance.
Daughter was there, fiance.
The
Yeah, it was
Grove
great.
City
Good time.
Institute for Faith and Freedom team. So altogether, it was just an excellent event. Great speeches from Rand Paul and RFK Jr. and you. So it was great, and you'll definitely have to check out the clips of that. But for now, thank you so much for watching this episode of the Weekend Spectator. Make sure to go to spectator.org for more, and always like, subscribe, share with your friends. It's what spreads the episode wide and far, and we always really appreciate your support. So let us comment, let us know what you think, and we will see you next week.
See y'all next week.